Okay, hey. Thank you, everybody, the whole TJ community, especially Kyle, for organizing the screening, and Sachiko for inviting me to her class this morning. We had a nice discussion about Tested, the other film that Kyle referenced. I'm going to talk a little bit about the genesis of the project, and then we'll open up the floor to Q&A, if that's cool with everybody. So as you noticed from the film, I grew up in Detroit, and this was a case that really helped shape my identity. I didn't mention this in the film, but my family was very closely connected to the case. My grandfather's brother was actually Vincent's best man. And so, you know, it really, just remembering all the different moments after Vincent had been attacked, and, you know, my parents pulling us aside and having that conversation about, like, maybe some people are not going to like you for the color of your skin. I mean, that was really something that was formative for me as a kid. But despite that, I went on with my life, and I sort of forgot about the case. I went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, got a creative writing degree, ended up in New York having a great time. First job was literally standing in the middle of Times Square, passing out flyers, trying to get people to go to a Broadway show. Ended up in Hollywood, writing for TV for a number of years. And then, something happened back home, back in Detroit. My dad passed away, and I had to go back and sell the family business, this restaurant that my great-grandfather had opened up. And when I was back there, I was just sort of having this midlife crisis, like, what am I doing in Hollywood, writing bad TV shows? There's got to be something more meaningful I can do with my life. And I thought back to this case as something that had really shaped my identity, because I thought, like, this is a story that connected me not just to my own family, but my community and my own identity. And so I decided I was going to make this film. I didn't even tell my agent about it. He would have said, go get a studio job. But I really, really wanted to do this. And so I just started asking around. I didn't have any documentary making experience, but I had filmmaking experience and writing experience. And I just started, picking up the phone, calling people and say, hey, I want to make this film. And, I mentioned this earlier. It's like, this guy in San Francisco, heard I was making this film, and he said, hey, I want you to do a good job. I'm going to raise all the money for you. And I was like, be my guest, and he actually did. He raised all the money for me. Even before we finished the film, some college students had heard about it. They asked if I could show it at one of their conferences. I did, and it just started to snowball. And as Kyle mentioned, at some point, I've gone to over like 500 places, around the world screening the film. Amnesty International in London, the Norwegian government brought me out there right after that whole Anton Breivik. You remember the white supremacist out there? They brought me out. So it's been a really great opportunity to sort of talk about these issues, and not only just to get people to remember the case, but then also talk about how these issues are still relevant, even in their own communities. And so it's been a really, really great opportunity. And I was particularly interested in coming to Japan and screening here because of the whole Japan bashing back at that era. And at that time, there were a lot of Japanese press that was in Detroit covering this case. And so I'm sort of curious as to whether or not these issues still resonate here. And so looking forward to this conversation. So I open up the floor to any questions you guys might have.
Hi. I saw Rene Tajima Pina appear somewhere in the film, and as you know, she created the film Who Killed Vincent Chin. And I wonder what, if any, influence you received from her, and whether she was receptive to the idea of creating another film on Vincent Chin. And also, I'm wondering whether you try to work hard to make your film as different as possible from her.
Okay. This is going to be on YouTube, so I'm going to be very careful about what I say. Rene was very supportive because she's obviously in the film. Christine, who is her partner in it, I think, has other issues, but I think maybe that's something between those two. That's all I'll say. But yeah, in terms of the reception, I mean, it's been really, really wonderful and supportive because I think anybody involved with the case is just, happy that there are additional opportunities to talk about it, right? And part of the challenge is that first film that you mentioned, Who Killed Vincent Chin, wonderful film, really great, goes into real wonderful detail, very emotional. The problem is that, it's a a film that's not in circulation now because of the rights. They haven't. It's a very expensive film, and so it's not as accessible. You know, and I think that when we were deciding, whether or not to make a film about this, I think that, because that first film is so excellent, we felt that we had to come up with a justification. We didn't want to just redo their movie. And so we had to think of what was the one thing that sort of came out of this case that was positive, or that we could sort of look forward, and take a tragedy and turn it into something positive. And for us, it was this notion that Asian Americans, in some ways matured as a community. And so that's why, for us, the film really is about something more than just Vincent Chin. Yes, it talks about the Vincent Chin case, but it talks about the impact of it, and where as a community we can move forward from there. And so I think in that sense, that was our thing. We wouldn't want to just make another film, redo their film. I mean, so. Mm-hmm.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Michael Williams. I'm a teacher here at Temple University. I've been here since 1982. And I just spoke with you earlier that I have a course here called The Politics of Identity in America. And one of the themes that we talk about is Asian American identity. I noticed during the film you had many people that you interviewed, but not one of them mentioned the term model minority. And I'm wondering why was that? Is it because that this term evokes a kind of desire to break away from that and not to mention it? What are your thoughts on that?
My personal one, or why is it not included in the film?
Either or both.
I don't think we consciously avoided it. I mean, I'm thinking back to all the interviews, and this is a while ago now, so, but I don't think anyone really used that term, because I think in some ways that's a reactionary term, right? And it's not proactive, and so I think maybe that's why people didn't naturally bring it up in conversation. I know that for myself, it's not an issue that I oftentimes talk about, at least not in such a simplistic term of just, that. I mean, I will talk about it in terms of how social stereotyping, right, does impact it, but I don't think I just, use that singular term, because I think it oversimplifies it a little way. The other thing, too, that I think that we as Asian Americans have to be careful of is sometimes downplaying some things, right? And not necessarily appreciating some of the successes that we've had in the country and the discrimination that we've come over. I think that part of the challenge for me is, as someone whose politics was really developed within the gay context, and the big term in gay politics is pride, right? It's always talking about the great things that your community does and not to let people put you down, which is quite diametrically opposed to being Asian American and Asian culture, which is, don't stick out, keep your head down and stuff like that. And I think that infuses Asian American politics to some degree. And I think that for me, it's reconciling the two. And, in terms of the successes of Asian Americans, in terms of overcoming the discrimination that we faced in America, I think that we shouldn't necessarily be ashamed of it. We should recognize, how it came about, right? And maybe where sometimes we have had some advantages over, say, other minorities, right? I think that it's a much more complicated situation. That's why I don't necessarily always just use that term.
Okay. May I have another question? Sure. One of the members that you interviewed mentioned that they didn't have a solid organization backing them up, like the NAACP. But I think that that's maybe a misconception. Many civil rights events are often spontaneous. For example, a lot of people don't realize that the Rosa Parks bus incident was actually spontaneous. And they had had ideas about doing something like that, but it just happened. A previous person wanted to take a case, but there were some things that they decided not to go forward with that because she had a child out of wedlock and so forth. But when Rosa Parks had her case, they said, let's do it now. And it was spontaneous. And my university, my old university, was active in printing out leaflets to get people to come to a rally. And when the organizers came together and they called Martin Luther King at this church and said, we're coming to your church. And he said, no, 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 no. He said, well, we're coming, so you better get ready. So my point is that many events like this happen spontaneously. Unfortunately, it happen in events that are not such positive way, in a positive way, but it spurs people on.
Yeah, I mean, that's a sad thing about, civil rights actions, I guess. A lot of times they are in response to something that's negative that's happened, and I think that's partly why we wanted to make this film, was that you don't have to wait for the next Vincent Chin to happen or the next Trayvon Martin or the next, a terrible, horrible thing to happen because, A, we have a history of seeing it, and B, we know that these things will happen again. And so that's why it's so important to sort of get ahead of the ball on these and to talk about these issues and to sort of diffuse some of the tension and so that people can see sort of things happening. And so I think that is unfortunately the sad part, is that people often respond to something that's bad happening, but hopefully there's enough people having these conversations so that we don't have to wait for the next thing to happen. The one thing that I would also say is that, yeah, I mean, just because somebody says something doesn't mean it's always true. I mean, these, they're talking heads, they say whatever. I mean, and if you actually do the research, I mean, there is a long history of Asian American political activism in our country. The second oldest civil rights organization in America is actually the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, which was created after all the Chinese Exclusion Act laws, the oldest being the Anti-Defamation League, And so, it was the first racially based civil rights organization. It's still a very active organization now. The whole notion of, a lot of the original laws which were race-based in America were directed at Asian Americans because, with other communities of color, there were different ways of dealing with them. I mean, a lot of Native Americans had been pushed onto reservations. African Americans were, had slavery. A lot of Latinos were migrant workers. They weren't really coming and staying in America. Asian Americans were this one problem case because some of them were wanting to stay in America. And so if you look at a lot of the first laws of who can own land, who can immigrate into the country, marriage laws, all these things, who could go to which schools, a lot of them were first directed at Asians, which is some people don't think about, right? And that's why Asian Americans had to form these organizations very, very early on. And because that's where our fight was. Our fight was in the legal system, and that's why you saw a lot of that happening. So.
One more, if I may. Speaking of legal, am I hogging the mic? Yes, I am. But anyway,
there's a long line right behind you. Sorry.
Recently, the estate of the Chin estate has there was a civil suit which they won, and the Ebbets, I think, refuses to pay the damages for the civil suit.
Yeah.
And last year, I believe, he wanted to sell part of his estate, but the court said you cannot until you pay this, and he still refuses to admit any guilt. Have you heard anything further from that on that case?
Yeah, I mean, because we stay in contact, and these judgments have to be renewed. Am I optimistic anything's going to happen? And by happening, basically the only thing that could happen is this guy could pay the judgment, but that has accrued. I mean, it's worth millions of dollars now.
Right.
I guess the other thing that could happen is that this guy could have an epiphany and just sort of say, hey, wait a second, maybe I shouldn't have killed somebody, and go on a campaign now to sort of talk about these issues. Because you see that happening, right? You see sometimes people, they reform themselves. I don't know what the term would be, but unfortunately, you don't see that happening in this case. This guy still contends the fact that he was innocent of this. He does not feel that he, deserves to be in jail at all, and so I guess until he actually has a change of heart about that, right? What can you really do? And so again, the one positive thing that sort of came out of this was this notion that Asian Americans felt like, we should work together on these issues, and I feel like I like to stick with the positives in general about these things. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
No, thank you for your questions. I give you extra credit. Okay.
Hiya.
Hi.
I just wondered if you learned anything while you were filming the documentary that changed the way that you thought about the case and its relation to you, rather than within your family group.
Did I learn anything about the case, or thinking about specifically the case, or just politics in
Or
general?
things that came out of the case that you didn't know necessarily came out of it?
Yeah. Oh, you mean the legal impact of it?
Yeah.
Or just personally? You know, I think the one thing that on a more personal level, outside the legal stuff, is just how, in some ways, the case was polarizing even within our own community. You know, in our film, we show all these activists that were very adamant about, like, oh my God, you know, something terrible happened, we have to do it. But within the Chinese community, you know, there were elements who actually didn't want to fight this, who wanted to have this just go away, who in some ways did blame Vincent and say, like, well, he should have listened to his mom. His mom told him not to go to the strip club. And to me, that was, you know, that was disheartening to hear, but I don't know if it was a cultural thing, that maybe that's why they sided and they felt that way. So it wasn't even clear within our community, you know, where people felt like, oh my God, this was a clear, you know, sense of wrong. Maybe it's just that sometimes people internalize things, right? And, you know, and maybe that's what happened with a lot of these more Chinese immigrants who felt like, oh, we should just keep our head down and not cause trouble. And, you know, if something bad happens, it's our fault, right? And so I think in that sense, that sort of surprised me, the level of that. And, you know, I wish that didn't happen. But in terms of the legal stuff, yeah, I mean, doing research, I mean, again, when I first heard about this case, it really was from a very personal level. I mean, you know, I mentioned in the film, it's like seeing the, you know, invitation on the thing, but I just remember starkly, you know, because the thing happened on a Friday night, right? But by Saturday morning, we'd already heard about it. And I just remember my parents being in my grandparents' bedroom and, you know, them having a conversation about, well, who would go to the hospital first, and just, you know what I mean? Like very, you know, very, very specific details about that, and like wondering, oh my God, like, you know, and then, you know, obviously as the case went along, you know, but then also just seeing how I, as an Asian American, was being perceived, like, you know, like being scared to go to school and wondering if kids were going to ask me about it, you know, and when kids did ask me, you know, like having conflicted emotions about it, right? And, you know, I said this earlier. So I'm working on this memoir, actually, of growing up as an Asian American in Detroit. It's called Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant, right? And I have this one chapter. It's a really funny book, hopefully. But we have this one chapter, you know, where we talk about this, right? And just all those emotions about, like, oh my God. I mean, the kids at school used to call me Charlie and Bruce. Now they're calling me Vincent. And it's like having a disconnect of, well, what did they mean by that and stuff like that. So I think for me, on a very personal level, it was more surprising back in that moment, as opposed to, say, some of the cases, the implications afterwards, you know. But I am proud of the things that did come out of it. I mean, for one, the specific notion of hate crimes being expanded. I don't know if it was clearly articulated in that, but in America beforehand, hate crimes was really a black and white thing. But after this case, it really expanded to include all different types of, you know, not just racial communities, but, you know, gay and lesbian issues, disability, you know, so there's a lot. And the other thing, too, is the concept of minimum sentencing. You know, that was something that, you know, I think people realize that, you know, if someone, you know, dies in a case like this, you know what I mean, you have to, you know, have a certain amount of minimum sentencing to it. And that's something that sort of came out of this case, too. So there are some really landmark things that came out of this case that people have sort of forgotten. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I am Mia Suga of Tokyo Gakuin University.
Oh.
Your video and comment really reminds me of my talk and discussion debate between me, myself, and Japanese American friends when I was studying at UCLA Asian American Studies Center in 1991 and 1992. Because of the fact that the Japan bashing was so heated up back then, and Japanese American friends often criticized Japanese who were too arrogant, too aggressive, too business oriented, so that the Japanese American or Asian American become a target of hate crime, just like Vincent Chin. So that the tension between Japanese from Japan and Japanese Americans were kind of bitter and sometimes very sensitive and emotional. So that's what I experienced at the Asian American Studies Center in 1991
So you're
and
saying that the
1992.
Japanese Americans were actually blaming the Japanese?
Yes.
And were these Japanese Americans West Coast Japanese
Yes.
Americans? Okay. See, there's a big difference.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
In America, like,
Okay, yeah.
okay, yeah. okay.
Japanese American, mostly from California.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
even worse.
Yeah. Yes.
Anyway, I'm kidding.
Okay.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Right. So then
Are
I
you?
can, yeah.
Okay,
So
yeah,
we
yeah.
can't really generalize the
Yes.
Japanese Americans.
Yes, yeah.
You know, Japanese Americans as Japanese American because
Yeah.
locality, you know, Hawaii Japanese, Japanese Hawaiian,
Yeah.
Japanese in the New York, and Japanese Americans in San Francisco, and even Los Angeles may be different approach to have a viewpoint towards Japanese. But I
Yeah.
just wanted to ask you about how do you make of personally the relationship between generally Chinese and Chinese American.
Oh, how did I view that? Well, first let
Yeah.
me address the other issues, about the Japanese American response. I would say that in Michigan, where I'm from, I think that I'd never sensed that. I mean, I think that because we knew the auto industry and we could sense the arrogance of the American auto industry, I don't think we prescribed that to that because we were intimately aware, because some of the criticism of the Japanese auto industry were things like, they don't buy enough American cars, right? Or they've got all these, limits, right? But, we knew that the American car companies were not putting the steering wheel on the correct side of the car, right? Thinking and that the cars that they build in Detroit are much larger than what people here in Japan are used to. And so, we knew that to some degree it was the arrogance of the American car companies. So I don't know if we attribute it. So I don't know if the Japanese Americans in California actually knew enough about the auto industry and what was going on with that to understand that debate. So that's one thing I would say. And I see these Californians laughing, so I don't know what that means. Okay, sorry. In terms of your other question about like Chinese versus Chinese Americans, I think I'm a weirdo.
Not necessarily Chinese versus, but Chinese mutual, contact, because there was a huge sort of distance between Japanese from Japan and Japanese Americans in California back then. So I was wondering what the situation is like, more mutually cooperative or mutually, interactive.
Well, I think that because of my own family's history, I'm probably an anomaly when it comes to this kind of stuff, but I actually grew up not thinking of myself as Chinese. I've always grew up thinking of myself as Asian, and I think that's partly because in Detroit, our Chinatown was mixed. I mean, there were, Filipinos, there were Indians, and, in school, right, like the first school I went to was, majority African Americans. There was like one other Asian family, they were Korean, and obviously, you're gonna hang out with the Korean. I mean, I didn't have that luck, my brothers did, but you know what I mean? So there was always this connection between the Asians. I think maybe when you grow up in an area where there are fewer, maybe this term Asian is actually more common and more stronger than maybe a place like California or Hawaii. But in terms of the idea of China, I don't even speak Chinese, you know what I mean? My family's been in this country since the 1800s. And so the notion of Chinese politics or a connection to it, or even the whole China versus Taiwan thing, it doesn't really register with me at all. I mean, so yeah. So I don't really have a strong opinion about that. But if your question is, did I see any connection between, say, like a Chinese community and a Chinese American community concerning the Vincent Chin case? I don't recall the Chinese American or Asian American activists trying to connect with Chinese nationals or anybody along that line for support or connection. I think they first went with other Asian Americans, But actually, more specifically in Detroit, a lot of their connections that they were making with other minority groups, like African Americans and Jewish Americans, because when you think about political organizing, there are a lot of skills that you have to learn, actually, right? Like how to write a letter to the editor. How do you get an article in the paper? These are not things that you know, right? How do you put together a political rally? How do you get the police permits? And so they basically reached out to the communities in Detroit that actually had experience, doing this. And so I think that's where a lot of the connections they were making. And again, maybe Asian American history is that maybe prior to this, Asian Americans wasn't as useful a term. Like Chinese Americans didn't get along with Japanese Americans. But I think that recognition is that if other people can't tell us apart, we may as well work together. And so I think that's why, you know, they started working across, and they just naturally expanded that to other Asian Americans, right? Because they can't tell us apart, right? And so
Yeah.
we are, you know,
Right.
perceived. So.
Thank you so much.
Hi. Thank you first for making this film. I had actually never heard of Vincent Chin. I'm Japanese American.
Before today?
Before today.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah. I actually didn't hear about Japanese internment until college. So
Wow,
I
where'd you
grew
grow
up in
up?
South Florida.
Okay.
Yeah. South Florida. Actually, my parents lived in Michigan, late 70s,
Wow.
early 80s, and they never talked about
Are your
Vincent
parents
Chin.
immigrants, or did your family
Yeah,
go
they're
through the
immigrants.
internment?
They're
Oh, okay,
immigrants.
okay.
Yeah.
When you heard about the internment, did you talk to them about it?
No.
No. It'd be
No.
interesting what their thoughts on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But yeah, so seeing this movie kind of made me think of a lot of things, and actually, I made a film myself. So I talk to you later about that,
Okay,
but
yeah, sure.
not about this. But so I was just curious. You know, I think there are a lot of Asian Americans out there that probably have never heard of Vincent Chin, maybe even not even heard of the internment camp. I'm wondering why you think Asian American issues like this are not taught in schools or in the media. Yeah. Or like, for instance, another thing, it's somewhat related, is that it's almost like okay to still make fun of Asian Americans in a certain, or Asians, I
Yeah.
think. For instance, like, remember there was a Oscars So White
Yeah.
thing? In that Oscars So White, or the Oscars that year, they were really sensitive around, like, you know, the black issues and stuff like that, and not offending the black community at all. But they had two terrible jokes about
Yeah.
Asians in that ceremony. I don't know if you remember that, but
Yeah, the Price Waterhouse jokes. Right?
yeah. So I don't know. It just seems to be accepted. I don't know. I was just curious what your theory is on why Asian American issues are treated like this, and yeah,
Huh.
it seems to be okay.
Yeah, so are there two parts of that question? One is about more history, and then the other part is more just about popular culture? Or do you want- are
Sure.
they more
I
mixed?
mean, whether or not you think they might be connected somehow or not, or
Yeah, well, I mean, the history part is always, yeah, and we're not that old a country, right? So we really should be able to get through everything, you know, in a year. But I don't know. I think that part of it is that it needs to be better integrated. I mean, for one thing, so my second film that you guys didn't see here is a film called Tested, right? And through making that film, which looks at the lack of racial diversity in the top public schools in New York City. So I'll quickly talk about it, and then I'll answer your question about education, because that's what that's addressing to. So in New York City, they've got these really great magnet schools, which they call specialized high schools, right? Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, you know, Brooklyn Tech. The only way to get into these schools is to take a single standardized test. Okay? The issue in New York is that the New York City public schools are 70% black and Hispanic, but at the top school, Stuyvesant, it was only 1% black and 3% Hispanic. Meanwhile, it was 73% Asian, right? And the interesting thing for me in making that film is that Asians actually have the highest poverty rate in New York City. They're the poorest community. They're taxi cab drivers. They are nail salon workers. They're waiters in Chinese restaurants, right? And so I wanted to sort of look at that confluence between like race and class, because a lot of times people overlay those two things as if there is a direct 100% correlation, and there isn't, right? Because you have to look at the way that poverty and racial stereotypes plays upon itself, right? You know, even though immigrants may be really poor, there's a different stereotype about them than, say, being a poor black person, right? And so, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of making that film and learning about education policy, you realize that, that that there are a lot of problems with the American education system. One of the problems, beyond the curriculum that they have, is who is teaching that curriculum, what interests do they have. 80% of teachers in America are white and female and from middle-class backgrounds, right? And so oftentimes the things that interest them, the things that they find most exciting, oftentimes are probably things connected to their own personal backgrounds, right? And so I think maybe that's one of the first things that we need to do, is we need to diversify the educational teaching workforce in America so that you have different perspectives, so that you have teachers that do get excited, you know, or who have a personal connection to, say, the internment. If we had more Japanese American teachers, when a subject like the internment camp comes up, right, which is very relevant now if you're talking about current events, right, with what's happening with the Muslim ban, et cetera, you have somebody in that classroom who can share a very personal story about it and offer a unique perspective, which I think enhances the educational opportunities for all those kids, right? So I think that's probably the first thing that you need to do to address that issue, is that why. You know, why don't we do it more? And then if you really want to get really political, which I am, you know, you actually have people who actually who don't want to talk about these subjects, right? You have a state in America, Arizona, which has banned ethnic studies. You have the state of Texas, right, which has removed Cesar Chavez from the history books, right? Why is that so important? It's because because the state of Texas is a very big market. And these publishing companies do not make books for each state, right? And so when you have a big state like Texas, which says you have to remove Cesar Chavez, it's out of everybody's books, right? And so you have these forces in America that don't want to talk about the contributions of minorities, right, who seem to be gaining steam in America lately, right? But then you also have these other things which are not as blatantly racist, but just more subtly, you know, like, you know, part of, is it subtly racist? Well, it's just, I guess, yeah. It's just a lack of interest, you know, amongst some educators towards some stories that they just don't find as relevant to their lives or don't think are going to be as universal. But as a person of color, you feel that our stories are just as universal, that they are connected, not just to the history of America, but also to the current issues that we're dealing in this country now. And we think that our stories are vitally important to, you know, include in the conversation. Like, so I make a film about Vincent Chin. Yeah, it's a Chinese American, and he died, like, you know, almost 30 years ago now. But I think there's a relevancy about his story connected to all these other issues. You know, when the Trayvon Martin's case happened, and this was around the time that our film came out, it was that connection of, like, well, what was the discussion going on with Trayvon Martin, right? The discussion was, like, you know, amongst some people was, well, what was he doing in that neighborhood, right? You know, why was he wearing that hoodie? It was the same discussion that was happening to Vincent Chin back in the day. You know, why was he in a strip club? Who spoke out first, right? And it makes you connect that, you know, when you're a person of color, and I mentioned this in the class earlier today, when you're a person of color, you have an extra burden to prove your innocence, right? You know, you are not perceived as a victim even when you are the victim in a crime. You know, they were trying to look for ways to say that the white perpetrators of these crimes were the innocent party and trying to figure out, like, oh, well, what was going on in his life? You know, and what did this person of color do, right? And so I think that that's the importance of going back and looking at history and connecting those things, you know, and saying that our stories and the experiences of people in our own community have a relevancy. And that's why, you know, we just have to keep talking about them. We have to make films to talk about them. We need to have more educators in the classroom who are connected to these stories talk about them. And so, yeah, it's pretty deep connected in that sense.
Right,
So,
thank you.
I'm not talking too long, but.
Okay, I think I've probably, this is the third time I've thought about Vincent Chin. First time, of course, was when it happened. It was in the papers. I was appalled. The second time, actually,
Where were
was
you at the time?
Huh?
What part of the country, or where were you at?
I think I was in Korea and dealing with trade issues.
Oh, okay.
So
okay.
obviously the auto business and
Okay.
the trade friction of that time was pretty intense, you know. But the second time actually was when 9/11 happened, and I believe there was a Sikh that was also beaten up very badly. Was he murdered? I think he was.
In Arizona, Balber Singh Sodhi?
Someplace.
Yeah.
Can you draw, based on your positive approach to things, I don't know what happened in the aftermath of that particular murder. was the outcome more just than Vincent got 35 years ago?
I actually have had I don't want to say fortune, but we did a screening in Arizona where actually his brother came to the screening and served on a panel afterwards to sort of talk about that. So in that sense, that it was turning a tragedy into something positive, right? And drawing those connections once again. I mean, so that is my immediate response to it, is that, again, it's terrible that it took a tragedy to sort of make people feel connected and to find their own voice. But in the sense that it's good that his brother is, you know, trying to keep his name alive, you know, and making sure that people are all aware of these issues of xenophobia, you know, that exists. So, yeah.
Was justice better served in Arizona
More
recently, within 70, so half the time in Vincent?
Yeah, I actually don't remember the specific outcomes of it, but I'm also trying to connect to more recent cases that you've heard, like in Kansas, where, the two South Asians were killed. The grad students, were they grad students? You know, because they were in a bar and you know, these people just killed them, you know. I'm trying to think of some other more recent cases, because I don't think you have, these aren't just isolated cases that happen every 10 years. These are things that happen all the time. You know, I'm trying to think of more recent ones where there was this egregious or terrible outcome. But I think it's just, that general, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know specifically the answer of how that one happened. Yeah.
I'm back.
Hey.
One question and a comment. For the young man who said he hadn't heard about the Japanese internment, there's a great website about the Japanese American experience called Densho, and it has lots of interviews, photos, and it's a wonderful site. That's your starting point, I would suggest. Curtis, you mentioned that your family has been in the U.S. since the 1800s. Were they there when VINCENT WHO tried to start the Asian or Chinese Americans to assimilate into American society?
I hate to admit this, but my family was here, but they were like the gangsters. They were like,
okay, so
yeah,
you were probably against VINCENT WHO then.
I don't know what they were doing.
No, but he was considered the first Chinese American. He went to Bucknell University, and he suggested that the Chinese community cut the queue and wear Western style clothing and so forth. But his advocacy was a double-edged sword, and you mentioned it earlier about the Asian community, because Chinese Americans are saying, why should we have to assimilate? This is our culture. Why do we have to give this up? And then there were others saying, yeah, maybe they'll see us as not people who eat rats and so forth and so on.
So a little bit about my family history and then that. So yeah, I'm just thinking about it. So I think about the old pictures that I've seen of my first relative that first came to this country, and no, he did not have a queue or anything like that. And so my dad's side of the family ended up in Michigan in the late 1800s, and my mom's side, for some reason, ended up in Ohio, in Canton, Ohio. And I hope that they didn't move to Canton, Ohio, because they're from Canton, China. I don't know, but I have a theory that that's kind of true. They did the laundry stuff, and then, the restaurant stuff when that happened, because of, if you've studied the history of when Chinese food came out, because that's actually a big part of my book, right, is that, when America and China started to become friends because of the World War II, there was this fascination with Chinese food and these new allies of America, and so Chinese food really took off. And so my family opened up a restaurant, and it was, and I'm not kidding here, but it was the best Chinese food in all of Detroit. It was like where everybody went to eat. And I actually did the math on this, that over the course of the years, it's not around anymore, but over the course of the year, my family sold over 10 million egg rolls, and my grandma made them all by hand. My grandma made 10 million egg rolls. I mean, that's incredible, right? And so that's my family's history. But in terms of your question about this idea of assimilating or not assimilating, I think that's something that all immigrant communities, deal with in terms of how much to hold on to. you know, your culture from traditional society and how much to adapt to American society, and what are your reasons for coming, right? I mean, like, you know, is it to get a fresh start, or is it, you know, whatever persecution you might have? You know, I don't know if my family was ever so political where they made conscious decisions like that, but, you know, but I know that even now we have this debate within Asian American circles, right? I mean, like, how much of getting ahead is about adapting and learning certain social norms versus how much of it's just being yourself, right? And I think that is a discussion that's still happening, and that the dynamics of that discussion will continue to change. Like, the thing that immediately pops into my head is one of the criticisms of Asian Americans is that we don't speak up a lot, right? And that's one of the reasons why, you know, so upon college graduation, Asian Americans have the highest employment rate, right? Because the stereotype of the Asian American is that we're good workers, we follow orders, we listen, we're team players and stuff like that. That's great for entry-level jobs, right? But the stereotype required to get advancement and promotions are creativity, outspokenness, et cetera, et cetera. These are not traits that you typically, you know, connect with Asian Americans, okay? And so for Asian Americans, they have to ask themselves, well, how much of your personality do you have to change in order to get those promotions, right? Because in a scenario like in a boardroom, right, where, or a pitch meeting, where the people that get promoted are the ones that are willing to just jump up, right, and to like contribute, quote unquote, right? But for a lot of Asian Americans, or in a lot of Asians actually, sitting in a room and not talking doesn't mean you're not contributing. You're thinking, right? You're processing, and then, you know, it's probably better to not say as much and then say the one right thing, right? But in America, I think you get credits for how many words come out of your mouth, right? And I think that, you know, and so that's a different way of succeeding, right? And so as Asian Americans, we have to ask ourselves, do we play that game and talk as much as we want, or is that a temporary situation, and that you actually hope that in the long run, American culture changes to sort of appreciate, you know, workers who don't necessarily always have to speak out, who are a little bit more thoughtful, and who are a little bit more consensus building and not grandstanding, right? And so these are cultural aspects that I think that, you know, as Asian Americans, we have to ask ourselves, you know, okay, what are short-term adjustments that we will make to succeed, and what are some long-term fundamental things that we will change? Because we do agree that these are not, you know, social ideas that we believe in.
Do you think there's a popular sitcom in the U.S. called Fresh Off the Boat? Do you think sitcoms like that may be trivializing or romanticizing the issue of assimilation?
What is it?
Fresh off the boat?
No. What is that term when you say something? Full disclosure. Full disclosure. The star of that show actually happened to be my roommate when I lived in New York, so I watched that kid grow up. So I can't talk too much negatively about the show. But I will say that, you know, when I read that book, oh God, this is on YouTube, right? Maybe we should talk afterwards.
Okay.
No. Do I think? Well, first of all, okay. So you guys know the show called Fresh Off the Boat, right? And you know the person it's based off, a guy named Eddie Huang. He's a little bit edgier. He has a show on Fox, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so he writes this book called Fresh Off the Boat, which is about a kid growing up in Florida, you know, and then eventually owning his own restaurant. And, you know, he signs a deal, and it's on ABC. And he gets all upset because they feel like they've watered down, you know, his voice. And to me, I didn't have much sympathy for him because it's ABC. ABC does that. That's an ABC type of show. If you wanted to retain your edginess, then you probably should have gone with a different network, right? So that's your choice, right? So I didn't have any sympathy from there. God, I'm going to get into a lot of trouble for this, but also, like, in terms of the book itself, you know, there's a bit of controversy because of the idea of, you know, the character and his relationship to African American culture, right? And how he seems to, I don't know, what's the term for it? I mean, he adopts it, or like he he gains cultural capital by talking in you know, hip hop voice and stuff like that. And for me, I find that quite problematic because I don't think that when Black and Hispanic people talk like that, they get cultural points, right? They get demerits for it, right? But when white and Asian kids dress and talk like that, they get extra points of being cool and hip and whatever. And as someone who's had to do a lot of code talking, do you guys know what code talking is? Code talking is something that people of color or any minority or maybe even gender, where you have to learn to adopt different languages based off the situation that you're in. So like for instance, if I'm surrounded by a bunch of Asians, I'll talk differently than when I'm surrounded by a bunch of white people, or when I'm surrounded by a bunch of Black people, et cetera, right? And you pick up all these things. And as someone who's had to learn code talking my whole life for a variety of issues, between like how I talk around gay people is much different than how I talk around straight people, right? Or people who I assume to be straight. You know, same thing with Asians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm very sensitive to those issues, and I think it's really problematic, you know, when you adopt things that aren't from your culture to get brownie points, especially when that other culture doesn't get that benefit. So I had an issue with it, but that's my personal issue with it.
So, like, growing up, I kind of, like, had my own, like, racial, like, I say midlife crisis, but basically, like, I had this, like, phase or this period where I kind of, like, as growing up, like, as a Black girl, like seeing all my white friends and stuff, and, like, seeing how, I guess in some ways how they were being treated. Like, I myself kind of felt like, you know, like asking questions about myself, like, why wasn't I white, and, you know, like all this and that, and like, why isn't my hair straight, and blah, blah, blah. And so I'm just wondering, as an Asian American, if you yourself ever experienced that kind of like questioning your own self-worth, and like, because this never.
No, I'm kidding.
Okay, I was like, really? Because like this video,
I'm perfectly sane.
because this video is very empowering, like especially to Asian Americans, but it's also, in my opinion, like very empowering to me, like because it's very like just hearing about everybody's experiences and their struggles and stuff. So I was just wondering if you experienced that, and what you would say to other Asian Americans who are struggling with that, especially young children.
You mean racial stereotypes, or how I feel about myself?
Yeah, like stereotypes, and like cultural identity and stuff, because like you know, how there's a certain pressure to assimilate, you know, or at least that's like what I heard a lot in the movie about that. There's a pressure to assimilate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I could talk about this for hours.
Cool.
I'm writing a whole book about it. But so a couple anecdotes that I'll sort of share is like, so one, this idea of like, did I ever have questioning about my own racial identity and how that made me feel? I think that the idea of racial identity and longing to be something else oftentimes is rooted into who you perceive as having power, right? You always want to be part of that dominant group, okay? And so for me, that took its form differently depending on where I was at, right? Whether it's because I was in school, which was primarily African American first and then white, you know, or whether I was in Chinatown, where my family was the only, you know, English-speaking family, where, you know, all the immigrant kids used to make fun of me, you know, and they would call me, the term is juksin, which is empty bamboo, right? And so I get constantly teased for not being able to speak Chinese. And so as a kid, I didn't necessarily dream of being white. I dreamt of living in Hong Kong, because I'm like, okay, well, I could go to Hong Kong and be really cool back there, like all these other people, and I could speak, you know. So for me, where power lay, I don't know, whatever that term is, lay or lie, at that age, was not necessarily with white dominant culture, but there, because the people that I wanted to please and make happy were the Chinese immigrants, which is kind of weird. It's not normal, you know, but that's how I felt, you know. But then, you know, moving up, where I feel that as a person of color, or specifically as a Chinese American, where I wouldn't say that these things made me not want to be Asian American or not want to be Chinese American, but it definitely made me aware of my race. And again, apologies if I don't think there's anybody here from Sachiko's class, but I mentioned these stories, or a couple of these stories earlier, is that, you know, when I first started school, my family's been here since the 1800s. When I first started school, they put me in the English remedial class. I'm like, what? You're like, who am I with these people? Like, you know, like in the small room is really, you know, and you'd be pulled out and you felt like a loser. And so I think in that sense, I was like, I felt, I don't want to say I felt bad about being Chinese, but I felt like that was the reason they were pulling him out, is that they just made an assumption that I couldn't speak English. And then conversely, when they started the math program, they put me in the advanced math class, and I suck at math, and I'm like, you know, what am I doing with these people? And I think that I felt like, you know, I was pretty conscious that I think race and what teachers look at you, and they sort of think they know you, and they think where you're going to be. And I think I became a writer as a big FU to these people, to say, hey, I know how to speak English. And the other story that I shared was and why I feel like where I think race has had an impact. And not that I was ever going to be an all-star athlete or anything, but, you know, in high school, we had the presidential fitness test, right? And they make you do things like push-ups and sit-ups, and they test you how fast you can run. But out of all 400 people in my grade, I ran the fastest time, but I was never recruited for sports, ever. I was recruited for the science club, but I'm not for the track team. And it's just like, you know, do I think I would have been good or better, or could I have been? I don't know, but it would have been nice to have at least been recognized and to say, hey, you know what, you ran pretty fast. Have you ever considered it? And maybe I might have, you know, and because maybe I'd be running now. Definitely lose a lot of weight if I be healthier if that had happened, but it didn't, because I wasn't encouraged. And I think that's something to think about, is that, you know, these racial stereotypes, is that sometimes you might think that, well, there's a positive, but ultimately at the end of the day, they're all bad, because what it does is it limits your perception of yourself, right? Because you know there are additional obstacles that are put out there before you. And, you know, I think the only way is just, you know, you have to go with your gut of what you like and who you think you are, and just recognize that, unfortunately, other people out there are going to have more limited limited perceptions of you, you know, and, you know, it is hard to navigate sometimes, but, yeah, so that's sort of my response. Does that answer your question a little bit? Yeah, yeah, so. Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for sharing this story. It's been incredibly educational for me. I'm angry by the facts of it, especially because as we see, this keeps happening and happening to people. And I'm embarrassed as a U.S. citizen that I don't know about it. So I appreciate that you have come all the way to Tokyo to educate us about this reality. I appreciate that a great deal. You mentioned that you have shown this film and you have talked to over 500 different audiences about it. I'm curious about those audiences, about the places that you are sharing these stories. Are they places like this where people are inherently interested in Asian-specific topics? Who is inviting you to come? Who are you reaching out to because you think, I really want to share this with this audience? Can you talk about the dynamics of how you're sharing it and who wants to hear it?
Yeah, no, it's a big range. I mean, you know, sometimes, you know, they're historically black colleges. Sometimes they're like all white, like small private schools in the Midwest, which actually make it mandatory. So I'm presenting for a whole class of 1,000 white people who don't want to hear this shit, you know? And so it's like, you know, I have to adapt to each situation and, you know, try to at least present these topics in as, I don't want to say threatening way, because, you know, race is a very difficult topic to talk about for people. It really puts up their guards. And for me, I don't see it that way. I don't think talking about race is a negative thing. I think it's a positive thing. It's an opportunity for us to acknowledge our beings and our histories and our communities. And when I talk about being Asian American, it isn't to like bash other people, you know. And that's actually, I'll mention a couple of stories about this. So, and part of it is that, think about when our film is actually a pretty old film now. It's like, you know, about 9 years old or so. But when we first started coming out, it was right after Obama got elected, right? And so we had a lot of white people ask us, why do you need to make a film like this? We have a black president. And I'm like, well, I don't get that question anymore. I think people realize, wow, you still need films like this. But it was really interesting because one student, I think this was in Wisconsin, had actually, a white student had actually said to, me and said, why do you use the term Asian American? You're being kind of divisive, aren't you? You're just a regular American, right? Why can't you go with that? And so I have to give credit to what one student actually said, an Asian American student. He says, no, the term is not divisive. I call myself Asian American is because when people look at me, they only see the Asian part. They don't see the American part. I add on the American part to assert that I am American too. So to me, as a writer, it's very interesting how words are perceived differently, right? So maybe a white person sees the term Asian American and they get threatened by the Asian part, right? And they don't want to see it. But for the Asian American who uses that term, they're proud to use it because they want the American part. They're asserting their American identity. So this one term, Asian American, and how it's perceived by two different people, depending on your race, is fascinating to me, right? Some people see it as a divisive thing. Some people see it as something that connects them to America and is very, very pro-American. And I think that those have been some, this whole conversation about race, I mean, it's just really fascinating to me. And as we move forward, the conversation has changed a little bit because, during those years of Obama, there was a different perspective. So I actually, on my way to Korea, because I've got a bunch of screenings in Korea, and one of the talks I'm giving there is from the hope of Obama to the hell of Trump. And so, so I talk a little bit about like how racial discussions have changed a little bit, from then until now. And, it is really quite fascinating. And also when you think about like Black Lives Matter as the dominant discussion, right, before Trump got elected, and how, for me, it was a moment where we were sort of reevaluating. I don't want to say reevaluating, it's too strong, but needing to, maybe re-examine the term people of color, right? And how that coalition was having some tension and stuff like that, right? Particularly in terms of policy issue and stuff and things like that. And how, the election of Trump has sort of upended all of that, where it's now all hands on deck, again, right, where everybody, all minorities are now back together. But as soon as, we get a new president, and that will happen, and I'm sorry if I'm being too partisan here, but I did used to be a Republican, so I can say these things. But once we have a new administration, right, and some of those discussions that had started back then, right, with the emphasis of Black Lives Matter and Black and Brown, as an Asian American, that is something that we're going to have to look at, like in terms of how that all plays out, right? And how that impacts policy towards our community. And so it's a continual conversation that's always changing. And so that's interesting to me. So check back in about after the midterms, see how I'm feeling. Okay.
Hi, my name's Neil. I think you mentioned a little bit earlier about how the U.S. is somewhat an immigrant culture. And I come from a small town in North Alabama. It was founded by Germans. And in the they arrived in 1870s. And the founder of the town was actually attempted assassination by a Scottish-Irish person. And they remained very insular until the 1940s. Yeah. And I think the day after Pearl Harbor, the German language newspaper ceased publication. All of the German church services immediately switched to English. And I think that it's all part of integration. As you mentioned earlier, there's always a dichotomy between integration and assimilation. And it happens not only among Asians, but it also happened among the white immigrants to the United States as well.
Well, the term white is a fairly new term. Before, white people were defined by their ethnic, things. You were Scot-Irish, you were English, right. You were French or whatever. But now you have this term white because they needed it because there was a term for black and this term for Latinos and Asians. So everybody else was gone. And even the term Christian is a fairly new term. Before, people were Protestant or they were or Catholic or they were, Pentecostal or whatever. But it's just a process that happens in America, is that all these little subgroups eventually connect with one another, And so a lot of times people will say like, well, is there this term Asian American? Does it really mean anything? And I'm saying, no, it does, and this is what we do in America. We find the people that are most similar to us, and we get together, we form a little group to sort of, well, I won't say anything else, but we get together, yeah.
One other comment. You mentioned more recent cases. I mean, there was a case in North Alabama about a Sikh gentleman who was actually attacked by a local policeman, and he was actually visiting his children.
Oh, yeah.
And so this guy actually was received severe punishment. And also, I remember even in my home community, it was the 1980s. I'm sorry.
He did get punished, but I don't think the family was satisfied with the amount of punishment.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
But I'm sorry, I want to thank you for bringing this.
Sure.
Vincent Chin, I was not aware of the situation. But I think also in the 1980s, even in my local home community, there were a variety of, I think it was Vietnamese boat people that actually came to the U.S. And they were adopted by families were actually adopted by various churches. And so I remember one person received a job in the local town and was actually received a threat from a local, everyone knew, a KKK member. But he was actually prosecuted under hate crimes and went to prison. So that was a good thing.
Yeah. So what brought you out to this screening? I mean, are you interested in these general issues, or?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
I've been here a long time, so.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for coming and sharing all this.
Sure.
I'm Henry. I just want to say it has a lot of personal resonance for me, the stuff that you've been showing. I was born and raised in Chinatown, New York City. And during my high school days and college years in the East Coast, I was a huge rabble-rouser in Asian American stuff. But then, I don't know, it was just so tough, though, always fighting the man. And I don't know, and I had these negative experiences, including after I published something in a national publication in which I tried to make the Chinatown experience reflect universal themes. I mean, I submitted the story, but then the publication twisted certain things and presented in a certain way so that it kind of made me more foreign. So it kind of like got turned off from that. I mean, from the media. But anyway, like after college, and then I went off to law school, and I thought I'll continue in the social justice world. But then I just got really tired of fighting, and I just decided to join the corporate sector to work for the man. But then I experienced a lot of stuff in that world, and then so I went off to Hong Kong to work, thinking that I wanted to escape the man in the United States. But then the man is also in Hong Kong, actually, except that they're Asian, or from the British Empire. But anyway, I work here now. But I'm curious, to hear about how you got into this writing and film production and being a social activist, and what keeps you going, in that world. Because for me, I mean, all these issues are really important to me, and I care. And it's really great when my friends, I support my friends back home who are still involved. But for me, I don't know, I just got a bit tired, I guess. Maybe I'll go back to it later on. But I just want to hear how you kind of came to this and how you continue in this.
Well, I think just the idea of race and being conscious of equality, I mean, I think is just something I've always grown up with, right? Just because Detroit is a very racially polarized city. I mean, and so you can't help growing up there without some notion of where you fit in or don't fit in. And then also being gay, I think that's also, when you see how your community is treated so horribly, sometimes even by your own government, that it's just part of my fiber. But in terms of, I agree with you. Sometimes it can be, depressing and sad, and like feeling like, oh my God, why am I so serious? Why can't I just have more fun? Why can't I just relax? But, but I actually try to make it fun. I guess I try. I mean, I enjoy, being, traveling around. So I worked in Hollywood writing TV stuff. I did the creative writing program at Michigan, right? And so that was a really good program. There was like 12 people in it, so I got a lot of good personal attention. Went off to New York, did the struggling writing thing, won fellowships pretty early on, like probably within like 2 or 3 years. And so I was pretty lucky in getting some really good breaks, but also being able to study with some really, really talented writers, you know, which has been very great for me. And then working in Hollywood, you know, and this is before the time when diversity really was that interesting to people. I mean, you know, I'd work on staffs, and not where I'd be the only person of color. And when I say staff, I don't just mean writing staff. I mean like craft service too, and like lighting and crew and everybody. There just was no diversity whatsoever. And so at that era, you know, I also knew as a person of color that I probably couldn't tell my stories, right, like the way I would want to. I feel like there are a lot more opportunities now, and maybe at some point I might want to go back into it. I don't know if it's possible because Hollywood's a bit of an ageist system, so I don't know if I would be able to. But I think that there might be opportunities in different ways. But in terms of getting into documentary filmmaking, it's sort of, I didn't think that this would be my career, right? I thought I was just going to make a side project, right? Like, and I would go back into TV stuff. You know, and I was supposed to go back into TV stuff. But then, you know, I made this film and I started getting invited by people to go screen and talk about these things. And I feel like if you make a film, you should go, you know, if people want to see it, you should go talk about it, right? And, you know, the issues are important to me. And, you know, right around that time, Obama was getting elected, and I thought America was at a pretty powerful, important juncture in our history. And so I wanted to be part of that movement. And so it just seemed to naturally, you know, move in that direction for me to do social justice and empowerment stuff. And, you know, the idea of being able to travel and going around, like, so between the two films I've made, I've gone to over 600 places around the world, like, you know, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, going to meet people and talk about these issues and to learn about it. So, you know, as someone who only has a bachelor's degree in poetry writing, like I get to, like, you know, hang out with smart academics and pretend, you know, I know what I'm talking about, you know, and so it's kind of fun for me. Yeah.
So you didn't consider other careers like being a doctor or accountant, that kind of stuff?
No, and I'm fortunate because my parents had 6 kids, and I think they figured they could lose one and it'd be okay. So they never pressured me. Yeah, my older siblings got a little bit more pressure, and fortunately, my parents did have one golden child, number 2, who's a doctor, and he, you know, he does everything. Yeah, so yeah, I could be the goofball. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Okay, I think this might be the last question, but go ahead. Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
This is a lighter note. Thanks for being here. My name is Miko. I have a company serving multi-niche market in telecom services. I'm also Filipino, Japanese, Okinawan, English. Just speaking of Los Angeles, so Hollywood, and recent trend on the crazy rich Asians. How have you been since the early scenes of your childhood around Vincent Chin? And what is your take on Asian American actors on mainstream films like Aquafina, the Asian Ellen is mentioned in the Crazy Rich Asians? And what is your hope that this kind of film genre may be perceived?
That's 4 questions.
I know. Just wrapping it up.
Wait, okay, wait. So how do I feel about Asian actors?
The film,
Okay.
Crazy Rich Asians.
Okay, see, this is one of those things where you have to, like, separate, like,
Right.
you know, between your political side and your, like, you know, cheerleader side. And so on one hand, you know, I'm very happy that the film has met success. It actually exceeded my expectations, partly because it was a romantic comedy, and romantic comedies just don't do well. I mean, before the film came out, I was like, why didn't they make an Asian American horror film instead? Horror films are no-brainers. You make them for no money. People don't care who you kill in those films. You could kill a bunch of Asian Americans and people will still go watch it, right? But romantic comedies are a little bit harder because it requires you to put yourself in the shoes of the protagonist, right? And I don't know if, you know, if audiences, you know, primarily white audiences, were not even going to see white people fall in love on the screen, why would they go see a bunch of Asian people fall in love on the screen? And so I was a little nervous. So I'm glad that it exceeded expectation in that sense. You know, with that said, my political side says they probably should have called it Crazy Rich Chinese People instead, because it's so Chinese, and Singapore is a multicultural society, and they pride themselves on being multicultural. And for them and their presentation of South Asians in such a negative light, I think is very problematic. And I think they missed a golden opportunity because it's a film that likes to tout itself as about representation and breaking down barriers or like, you know, things. And so why would you do that to another community, right? When you are trying to hold yourself up and saying, look, we're a paragon of diversity and we're showing all these things. Well, then you know what? Do that for these other communities too. And I'm not saying you had to rewrite the whole book, I mean the movie, whatever, but in the book, you know, they have a South Asian character that could have been at the bachelorette party, right? Why did you write that character out? Or you have a scene where those two security guards, where you use the dark-skinned person as a joke because they laugh at them looking in the window. To me, that's problematic. Very simple fixes. And I don't think that that makes me too overtly political. I just say, hey, just rewrite it. Just take those things out. The film would be just as good. And you know what? Even better, because then you get into more buy-in from other parts of the Asian American community so that I don't have South Asian friends coming up to me and say, hey, you know what? I have relatives that live in Singapore, and this is not our reality. So that's my... Oh, that's yours? Okay, good. Great.
Curtis, thanks so much. That was really terrific. Very
Great.
interesting.
Great.